There we go. And I think that's, I think the settings are correct. Not working yet. All right. Well, let's see. I've stopped listening to myself years ago, so. Right.
Let me see if I can help you. Let's see. Everything's on there. Okay, it looks like he's on, not muted.
I love behind the scenes.
Could you
Come up
put it
front.
closer to your mouth there?
Why don't you holler into it and see what it does?
Hello. I'm hoping this will work then. Maybe now. Well.
Oh, that was maybe clearing your throat was good.
That's good. All right, the first hymn this morning is. All right, so maybe that will work. So again, welcome. So good to see you. I've got to run away just after class today. As you know, today is the Hyde Park 57th Street Children's Book Fair. You're looking at Peter Rabbit. I'll be wearing a huge costume and carrying a bibliography, right? What is it? Here comes Peter Cottontail with bibliography. That's right. Isn't that how the children's tune goes? Right. So I'm so glad to see you all. Thank you for coming. And I did bring some of the handouts from my car. I didn't want to frighten you, so here they are. We were saying that they can also be pulped and used for insulation if you need as well. Thank you as well for coming in person today. Glad to have had you online last week. So it's good to be together. It's good to be together in one room and face to face. I've been with my McCormick students face to face for the last 2 weeks, and maybe so. Thank you. Yes. Well, we're tracing some of the components of the emergence of the modern period, the terrors of modernity, the aftershocks and sounds of the modern period. So we're having some of them here as well. Right. All right. So here we go. Last week we talked about just some perennial temptations and some of the challenges concerning the views of self, views of community, and views of society. We were talking about temptations, like the Pelagian temptation, the temptation to think that we have nothing to do with anyone else, that we're not, in fact, drawn together, interwoven, interdependent, and that my experience of God's grace is in part dependent on you, and your experience of God's grace is in part dependent on me as well. We're part of a community. We are connected. We are intertwined in ways that we know about, and in so many ways that we are simply unaware of. We also talked about the Donatist temptation, the temptation to concentrate on the church of the pure rather than the church of the forgiven, the church of the rehabilitated, the church of the reclaimed, the church not only of the second chance, but the third, fourth, and fifth as well. If we view the church as somehow just a collection of the pure, then we cut ourselves off from the recognition that God is about the work of new things, new projects, reclamation projects, and gut rehabs, but of people, not of buildings, right? So today we're talking about the Reformations of the 16th century and talking about some of the ways in which the renewal and reform that upset and subverted the world in that time has created the categories and organizations and perspectives that we're still living with, that we're still coping with, that we're still chasing after in the good parts, and still trying to live down in some of the bad parts as well. So, who was it? Faulkner, who said, "The dead past is not dead and it's not past. It's still with us. We're still coping with aspects of things decided and things delayed and things endured from centuries past. And so we need to become better historians in order to become more faithful members of this community and of the wider community of the whole people of God." I hope that you got the first outline. The first outline is two-sided. Like most arguments, two-sided. And it has three pictures at the top, three pictures that talk a little, that are rooted in the realities of the 16th century. We're going to talk about them in just a minute. In some ways, we're talking about turning points. And you could call them turning points, you could call them churning points, you could call them learning points. However you wish to deal with them, the 16th century is in some profoundly powerful ways a hinge of history and the origins of the modern era, still chasing after us. Looking back from the 16th century, we need to remember some earlier turning points, like the emergence of the Jesus movement within Judaism and the continuing integrity and vitality and faithfulness of Judaism down through the centuries, down to the current time as well. I often challenge my students. We often think that when Jesus came, Judaism just dried up and blew away, when in fact Judaism continues in its promise, in its strength, in its integrity, in its covenantal relationships, in the faithfulness of the calling of the whole house of Israel, so that Rabbinic Judaism and subsequent developments of Judaism worldwide contest, compete, and argue with the Jesus movement, but also join in opposing various movements like the Gnostic movement and like the state-sponsored terrorism of the imperial perspectives, so that when Constantine, the most powerful person in the world, wants to join the club of the Christians, and transforms Christianity from an underground illegal movement into a decriminalized above-ground movement, that's really a remarkable turning point. It's a turning point that renders Christianity established, renders Christianity visible, renders Christianity credible with the intellectuals of the time, and renders the Christians vulnerable to the temptations of empire, to the temptations of establishment, to the temptations of power. Right. So a true turning point. Also, we need to remember that the issue of persecution in the early church is popular, but also a little bit complicated. That the numbers of Christian martyrs in the early church is a tiny number, but the cultural influence was profound and great, immense. And so we need to keep track then of numbers and scale and literary impact and literary influence, cultural influence, as well as just the numbers themselves. Very important point that is made clear. Once Christianity becomes legitimated and established in the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the numbers of persecution goes down. But outside the Roman Empire, the time of persecution of the friends of the Christians of the Roman Empire increases. So in Persia, the 4th century is the time of Constantine is considered a time of profound persecution because of the establishment and benefits that the Christians received within the Roman Empire. So when you go home and you bring down your dog-eared copy of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, I know that's what you were reading with your leg up while you were recovering. Right. Gibbon, 18th century Enlightenment person that he was, characterizes the Christians as an obstinate, stiff-necked, superstitious, mean-spirited people who brought down a great empire. Well, an empire that needed to fall, an empire that needed to be changed, an empire that needed to be transformed, evangelized, and challenged in its views of profound, ubiquitous sexual exploitation, of profound military adventurism, of profound power asymmetries, and a slave economy. So as you read Gibbon, bring it down. It's so wonderful to read. Great stylist, Edward Gibbon. Also think about the ways in which an opposing perspective brings about an upset of the most powerful empire of its time. Wow, a true turning point. Others, of course, include the emergence of Islam in the 7th century, the expansion of Islam in the 7th, 8th, and 9th century, and in so many ways, the creation of this, the appropriation of the streams of intellectual vitality from Islam by the West. So when we talk about the Renaissance and Reformations, we're really in some ways talking about the Western building on the foundations provided by Islam. I teach a course on the emergence of Islam. I'd like to come up and teach that here sometime. We Christians need to know more about Islam, just in order to be part of conversations and to be able to hear what is said and discern what is argued about the history and character and voice, vitality, and gift of Islam to the modern world, and the place of Islam as one of the 3 Abrahamic traditions, major Abrahamic traditions, that have been in continuous conversation. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, sharing in, blessed by, and arguing over the same scriptures. So that's for another time, but it is a true turning point and needs to be on our outline. And then, of course, the emergence of a really imperial European perspective, sometimes identified as beginning with Charlemagne at the beginning of the 9th century. All right, you can call him Karl de Grosser if you want. Charlemagne, it's the same guy. Crowned as Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in Rome by Pope Stephen. Founder of the Holy Roman Empire. Voltaire joked that it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it certainly wasn't an empire. Right, true. But it lasted for 1,000 years, all the way down till Napoleon. So that's really only yesterday from historical perspectives, and represents a significant turning point in the Christianization of what becomes Europe, and in the provision of the institutions and ideas that carry on the perspectives of Constantine and set up the contests that we see unfolding in the 16th century during what we call the Reformations of the 16th century. Incidentally, let's do pluralized reformations, all right? Let's bless the letter S. Today's class is brought by the letter S. And we should use the letter S whenever we can. Like Reformation should become reformations. There are several patterns of Reformation in the 16th century. So let's free ourselves to hit that S button whenever we need to recognize the plurality of perspectives, of programs, and of the contested polemics of not only the 16th century, but other times as well. Any other turning points that I've left out? Turning points, churning points, learning points, yearning points. Well, forgive that. I'm here all week. Yes, all right. So, Charlemagne, Muhammad, Constantine, yes. So when we talk about the Renaissance, I mean, the word itself means rebirth. It's a reclamation, right? The Renaissance, in some ways, creates the Middle Ages as that dark period that was stepped over in order to get to the glories of the Renaissance writers. Well, according to the Renaissance writers, their time was the best time, the brightest time, the time of lights, and that they were overcoming the darkness of the middle period. But let's face it, the middle period was also an intensely interesting time. The Middle Ages deserves a better reputation than it received from the writers of the Renaissance and the Reformation. But they did things that we do too. So interested in establishing the vitality and importance of their time, they denigrate and defame the times that came before them. We do this as well, right? We do it on a smaller scale concerning politics and culture, and we may need to take a longer view so that good people of First Presbyterian of Deerfield, we may need to expand our horizons a bit and stretch back a couple thousand years, not just a couple decades or a couple 100 years. We need to become better historians, to become better members of the communities, the religious communities that we're part of and seek to contribute to. So the Renaissance and Reformations, as long as we're traveling at this high speed, we know about the new worlds, we know about the printing press. Gutenberg's invention of movable press takes place in what year? 1450. Yes, in the 1450s, and it revolutionizes things. There are perhaps as many as 10 million items printed between 1450 and 1500. Stunning. 10 million discrete items that come off the printing press. And it ignites an intellectual firestorm. If you, Elizabeth Eisenstein's book, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, it's a real turning point, a real churning point. And as we were talking before the class, in some ways, it extends the reach of Western civilization in ways that other parts of the world were yearning but unable technologically to participate in the printed world. And so the development of the ideas of Western Europe depend on the printing press. It's unimaginable that the Reformation would happen without the printing press. It's hard to copy. I was tempted to copy out everything for today to hand out to you, but I'm not up to it. The photocopying machine or the printing press have multiplied ideas and multiplied points of access and multiplied audiences as well. So the printing press, the scientific revolutions of the 15th and 16th, especially 16th and 17th century, the Copernican revolution is in some ways the counterpart to the revolution wrought by Martin Luther. And then the unimagined wealth that was derived from uncounted and uncalculated cruelty, the emergence of chattel slavery, and the recognition that the West is built on slave labor, and that the capital of millions of hours of person-hour work are uncalculated, but they form the foundation of the beautiful buildings and texts and arguments of the European Renaissance and Reformations as well. Now, when I use the word New World, what am I referring to? I'm referring to North Africa. Between 1450 and 1550, most Europeans, when they talked about the New World, they were talking about the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai in West Africa, that was the New World, and that the Europeans were chasing after the brilliance of West African cultural achievement, West African commercial dominance, West African capacious reasoning, West African big ideas. The Europeans arrived in West Africa with nothing except gunpowder and alcohol and a readiness to trade in human beings. Right? Every time you put sugar into your coffee, you should also offer a word of confession, because the sugar that drove the plantations of the Caribbean and of South America and made the fortunes in Europe, European centers, is at the expense of the lives of those taken from, sold from, and burdened by the life in plantations in in the New World. So again, dark realities of brilliant achievements happening simultaneous, that this hinge of history in the 16th century should fill us with admiration and also should chasten us concerning the cost of achievement, the cost of brilliance, the cost of advance. Then cultural revolutions and industrial revolutions, again, we save this till another time. The bibliography remains at the bottom of the page. As a recovering librarian, I would just recommend a few of these titles. The one that I am enjoying right now teaching to my students is the one by Howard French, Born in Blackness. Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471. What happened then, 1471? Why pick that date? I mean, if it was 1453, I know that. That's the fall of Constantinople, right? When the Turkish Ottomans took over the city of Constantinople, eventually becoming Istanbul. But what happened in 1471? It's when the Portuguese built a fort just off what is modern-day Ghana, called Elmina, the mine, in order to gain access to and to seek control over the flow of gold flowing from the gold mines of Ghana, then under the collapsing power of the Songhai dynasty, and eventually it was recognized just how more profitable it was to deal in human persons than in gold, in pursuit of the most remunerative substance, sugar, and sugar cultivation.
Concept of the superiority and inferiority of races. Did that emerge this early, or I don't know?
Right. Thank you for talking about race, because the modern world is built on certain conceptions of race as well. With my students, I always say, before we can talk about race, I want to talk about place. I want to talk about Africa in the history of the Bible, Africa in the history of Judaism, Africa as a place in the history of the world, and the ways by which our understanding of Africa may prove to be an impediment to our understanding of place and race in the broader conceptualization of the human condition. So, for example, when you read Acts chapter 8 about the Ethiopian eunuch, where was the Ethiopian eunuch from? Pardon me? Ethiopia, but where's Ethiopia, right? Ethiopia is a general term that the Greeks use for everything south of Egypt. So one way of explaining this is, are any of you from the south? Anyone from the south? No southerners? Oh, are you from the south? Texas. Me too. We'll compare notes later. So you're from the south, but you're from a particular part of the south. Anyone spent time in Memphis? Anyone spent time in Georgia or in the Delta? They're also in the south, but they're very different, aren't they? Right? So when we say the Ethiopian eunuch was from Ethiopia, what part? Because from the Greeks' perspective, anything south of Egypt, anything as far east as Afghanistan and India qualified as Ethiopia. So we need to become slightly more precise, because if you ask a Texan and you accuse a Texan of being from the Delta, then you've got a fight on your hands, right? The most genial Texan won't accept that, right? So we need to be more specific about our geography in order to take up this question of place, in order to inform our conversation about difference, about appearance, and then about race. And the construction of race has its own history. The place of Arabs and Turks and Africans in conversation, the place of what becomes Europe in conversation with other parts of the world then, informs the emergence of a discourse, of a discourse of difference that becomes profoundly surcharged with power and prejudice. So that's another reason why we need to become better historians, to pay attention to the century before 1619, the current project, which is so important and so good and so worth reading, the book 1619 and the project, the publishing project 1619. 1619, when the first Portuguese captured and the middlemen of the Portuguese end up selling a group of African enslaved persons in Jamestown in 1619. So some contemporary voices would urge us to begin our conversation about slavery in the year 1619. I think that's great. But what we also need to do is pay attention to the century before that. For between 1519 and 1619, there's this magnificent presence of free and enslaved Africans in Europe and in the colonial Spanish world as well. So some would say that this profoundly racialized understanding of slavery is best tied to the 17th century, when colonial America begins to make very restrictive laws that apply only to people of African descent, and begin to identify slavery with a racialized identity. Wow. So already we've rendered more complex our common approach then to a history of slavery. We need to become better historians of the history of slavery in the modern world, but also in this country, in order to compare it with forms of slavery in other parts of the world, other colonial regimes, and the experiences of women and men who are enslaved. Right, so this book, I've got my glasses right here. This book, African Founders, How Enslaved People Expanded American Ideals, by the great American historian David Hackett Fisher, begins to talk about the ways in which enslaved persons and formerly enslaved persons press for a gospel embodiment of the Reformation values of equity and societal equality. Or the first book on the bibliography, Afro-Atlantic Catholics, America's first, not black, but black Christians. Sorry for that typo. You know, when you're typing after midnight, things happen, right? America's first black Christians. He says that we Protestants and we Protestant historians are ill-equipped to recognize the Christianity that was visible within Congolese Christians, Brazilian Christians, Caribbean Christians, because we factored out their faithfulness by our Protestant filters and our Protestant biases. Very interesting. So there's a lot of very exciting work being done that merits our attention and will benefit us if we dare to take up a challenging bibliography. Now, please turn the page. When you turn the page, these images are rooted in the realities of the 16th century, in the promise and peril and polemics of the 16th century, and help to highlight the many forms of Reformation that unfold in the 16th century and are still with us now. In the upper left-hand corner is that Dutch bastard, Desiderius Erasmus. He was an illegitimate child. He was the son of a priest, a Roman Catholic priest. He and his brother had no name, no fortune, no prospect, no privilege. And they were placed, both of them, the two brothers, were placed in a religious community run by the Brothers and Sisters of the Common Life, an intentional community, kind of like Reba Place down in Evanston. And there they found, given by the church, name, place, purpose, education, a pedigree of grace, to challenge the placelessness and namelessness that they had been born into in the late medieval system. Desiderius Erasmus is the so-called prince of the humanists. He is responsible for so much of the application of the Renaissance insights into transforming them into a Reformation agenda. We could spend some time recognizing his importance as a satirist, as a stylist, as a writer, as a teacher. He was a teacher, he wasn't a preacher. I like to say that whenever I'm asked to preach, I verify my calling as a teacher, not as a preacher, right? No, I'm glad that y'all are preaching today. Maddie, you're preaching today, right? Okay, all right, good. Desiderius Erasmus dies in 1536, a broken man. Broken because he saw the church of his time broken into different groups, different factions, and that his hope for Christian unity, a reformed church, a church so transformed by the Word of God as to be able to cure itself or be cured of its corruptions, wasn't happening, certainly in the 1530s. We're still chasing after his dream of a pacifist church in service to a culture-transforming gospel under the power of the Spirit. Erasmus dies not seeing what he had hoped and yearned for. It's a true yearning point for him. B, the Luther-inspired Reformations. Luther is there in the lower left-hand corner. Those of you who raised as Lutherans, you'll recognize the old boy. And he's the great champion, right? He's the doughy man of the hour who's called before the most powerful person in the world, the person who becomes the Holy Roman Empire Emperor Charles V. And he is required to recant publicly. And he said, I can't recant. I can't do other than what I know from the Word of God. He stands before the most powerful person in the world and says, at the time, fine, kill me. God will take care of me. I am entrusted with this word that will overturn this entire empire, the Word of God, rather than the word of Constantine, the Word of God, rather than the power of the Defense Department, the Word of God, rather than the tradition that spoke so loudly. Luther dies in 1546, just at the very eve of a whole array of changes. So much of what we see and call the Reformation, we need to read about from Luther. And we Reformation people need to have the collected works of Luther, if not on the bedstand, then nearby, right? Dog-eared and often consulted, because he helps set the stage for so many of the arguments and insights and some of the blind spots that characterize other movements of the Reformation. He is challenged early on by a group of radicals. You know them, the Mennonites, the Amish, the Hutterites. They're still around, the Mennonites. How many of you have spent time in Mennonite country or in Amish country? Right, they're still around. They're rooted in the 16th century. They said the Reformation didn't go far enough. And they pointed to Luther and John Calvin and others as having compromised the ideals of the Reformation. Very interesting. They weren't satisfied. Some called them Donatists, just as we talked about last week, because they concentrated on an understanding of the church as the church of the pure, not the church of the redeemed or reconciled or revamped, but rather the church of the pure. So they separated from the others and gathered themselves into gathered communities, typically out in the country, typically agriculturally based, often persecuted, sometimes even executed, but pursuing an agenda of reform that sought to replace the warring world that they saw with the war of the Lamb, the war of grace, the war of using the tools of the kingdom of God rather than the kingdom of men and women, the tools of pacifism, non-resistance, and separatism. It is the Reformed group that is our strain of the Reformation traditions. The folks associated with Ulrich Zwingli, Catherine Zell, John Calvin. Oh, yes, I mentioned a woman's name. You're right. So often the Reformation is told as a story by men, about men, and told to men. And so much of church history as well has been basically in a man's voice. But again, we need to become better historians in order to recognize, reclaim, and to proclaim the experience, integrity, contributions, leadership, and ministry of women throughout the history of the church. The Reformed folk have their own particular perspectives. We see them here. The Catholic churches are adorned with images. And while there are some interesting things here, why is this wall so plain? Why is there nothing on this wall? I mean, the art pieces here are recent additions because the Reformed tradition is fearful of idolatry, wary of idolatry, suspicious of art as being so beautiful as to be distracting from the proclaimed word. Why is it that the pulpit is so significant in your sanctuary and in most Reformed congregations, in most Reformed buildings? The pulpit and the proclaimed word assumes the preeminent place. The proclaimed word, the transformative word, the embodied word, the intentional word, the orderly word, the proclaimed word. You see a picture of Ulrich Zwingli preaching here in the upper left-hand corner on the front side of this page. He was the preacher in Zurich. In Zurich, on a typical weekday, you would go to the Grand Münster. Those of you who have been to Zurich will recognize this, that the preachers would come and gather, and the people would come to participate as well. First, the text would be read in Hebrew or in Greek, then translated instantaneously into Latin, and then spoken of in German, and then discussed. So bring your dictionaries and let's go, right? The proclaimed word, the community composed around the word and composed by the word. The Reformed folk sought to reclaim sanctuaries from the distractions of art and architecture. Wow, their fear was a fear of idolatry. And they sought the liberation from idolatry by reforming worship, aesthetics, politics, community, and family as well. There's a great liberation in iconoclasm, isn't there? But there's also a bit of a risk, right? That some people accuse Calvin of saying, why is it that you have no choirs, you have no vestments, you have no stained glass? Where's stained glass, incidentally? Where's that? This is a typical Reformed worship space, isn't it? No stained glass. I mean, in the sanctuary you have stained glass because in the 19th and early 20th century, Protestants woke up a bit and said, well, wait a minute, we also need some help, some guides, some aids to help our people learn about ways in which the natural world points to spiritual realities as well. But so this is a bit of an old school space. Someone accused John Calvin of saying, well, the images of the church is the Bible for illiterate people. And John Calvin said, that's exactly right. The church has failed to educate its people and instead sent our own people to rely on inadequate teachings rather than to come to the church as the transformative classroom for the saints and classroom for all those who might be transformed. So also then, Reformed folk talk about sacraments. Now, when you celebrate the sacraments, what what is your emphasis? Do you emphasize, this is my body, or do you emphasize, do this in remembrance of me? They're both biblical. They're both true. They both point to a mystery. They both embody profound grace and profound meaning and profound points of access to the holy. But what phrase do you focus on? Do this in memory of me. Do this in remembrance of me. Yeah. Right. Well, again, right, that how thick is your understanding of remembrance then? Because if it's just a kind of thin understanding of remembrance, then we may lose sight of the ways in which the wisdom of what you said and the insight of what you said can get lost in focusing on just the bread and just the wine. Zwingli speaks of a real absence at the Lord's Supper. Wow. Luther said, "What are you talking about, Willis? How could that be?" Calvin seeks to say what you just said so well, that we may begin with the words of remembrance, but we are called into a depth of engagement with God and a depth of an encounter with God in which God's very person becomes substance for us to dwell with and to dwell within. It's a mystery, but it's a mystery that is approached through phrases and metaphors and insight. And so the Reformed folk tend to focus on remembrance and commemoration, but there's a diversity of perspectives as well that invite us into a deeper engagement with God's presence, God's promise, and God's provision in the world. So, there are other patterns of reform, of course. The Anglicans, when the church in England becomes the Church of England, and then the continuing reformation of the church within Roman Catholicism. That Roman Catholicism wasn't just marching back in time, that the Council of Trent establishes the forms and structures that we see with us in the church today. They're still fighting or quarreling or discussing or discerning the import of the Council of Trent in the 16th century and the Second Vatican Council that occurred from 1962 to 1965. The past is still with us. These categories of reform and renewal are still with us. So if we're talking about different strands of Reformation, I'd like for us to first look at this collection of photographs, please, or images, please. Here, at first, the Pope is seen quarreling with St. Peter himself. This is clearly a Protestant image that is seeking to create a quarrel, or point out a quarrel within the Catholic Church of the 16th century, in which the popes are presented as having corrupted the very gift of the church itself. So it's hard then to read these Protestant sources from an ecumenical perspective. I mean, they are very, very pointedly anti-Catholic in their orientation, not only in their wording, but also in their images. The second page illustrates basically a critique of a 16th century form of the prosperity gospel at a pilgrimage site where so much money was brought in and so little grace was dispensed. The third page contrasts the poverty of Christ with the pomp and wealth of the then contemporary church. Christ and Antichrist is the way in which these artists presented this contrast, suggesting that it was Jesus whose feet were washed, but in the 16th century, it was the Pope's feet that were washed. And so again, feeding this contested identity of just how the church could be renewed and reformed without breaking into many pieces. The polemics of the time, the oppositional publications of the time are very rich. This illustration is produced in many ways, in which the many-headed beast of the time is identified with popes or princes or local politicians. And if you're looking through a 16th century work and you recognize yourself, then you realize that a lot of these conflicts were deeply personal and interpersonal as well. On the next page, you see the power of the Lutheran reform. Luther is presented here as a young man, indeed a powerful man for good and for reform. Indeed, he's considered and is named the German Hercules. And Hercules and his mighty works, Luther is presented as Hercules, and he is renewing and reforming the church by force. And he has the mascots of some of his defeated foes just hanging around his neck. The next page is a Roman Catholic response to Lutheran polemic, in which Luther is presented as the many-headed beast who says one thing in one region and says another thing in another era, and is presented then as the problem rather than the solution to the corruption of his time. And then there is also on the next page a presentation of Reformed folk like John Calvin as a many-headed beast as well. So finally, the last image then is of an unseemly sight in a church. On the very last image, an unseemly sight in which a Catholic, a Protestant, and a Reformed person are in church fighting. Ouch! So what happens? How is it that the reform and renewal of the church can be pursued in a way that makes some sense? I would suggest that it is this packet that can provide some relief from our confusion or our critique of the pettiness of the time. I made this in part because I think all of you should have a copy of it, and all of you should have a picture of this remarkable woman. She's Lutheran. She was a friend of Luther. She knew Luther. She wrote to Luther. He wrote back to her as well. And here she is confronting the doctors, the faculty at the U of I, the University of Ingolstadt. That's right. Right. And look at her. She's one woman against all these men. She's one woman with one book, standing out against all these men. She's one woman standing on the Word of God, giving her a place to defend herself and to critique her foes. There in the front is that old guy, Johannes Eck, one of Luther's old antagonists, and for a time the dean of the faculty, the Prince of Spleen, as he was called, there on the faculty of the University of Ingolstadt, Johannes Eck. And she has only the Bible to protect herself and to stand on the public role that she assumed. She said, "You men aren't pursuing reform. You are so indebted to the structures from which you benefit, you wouldn't recognize the truth if it came up and bit you." This essay that she writes, which is one of several open letters that she writes, says, "My parents did something for me when I was a child that was shocking." And it's true. When she was 10 years old, her parents gave her a Bible. And so she read the Bible. She found herself in the Bible. She did what people do. She read herself into the Bible, and she read the Bible into her own life as well. It gave her power. It helps illustrate the popular message of the Reformations, that an individual's voice matters, that an individual public confession matters more than tradition, more than power, more than establishment, more than tenure, ouch, more than pension, more than, right, she was willing to risk all in order to confess the truth that she knew and had read from the scriptures. She said, "How come you people are so concerned about putting people in jail? I don't remember Jesus putting anyone in jail," she says. Ouch. She's worth reading because she's recognizable as someone who derived the strength to speak truth to power from the Scriptures and from this Reformation possibility of the liberation of conscience and the presentation of an alternate authority above the sanctioned authority of 1,000 years of sanctioning of the medieval church. So it's worth seeing, worth reading. Then I also included this letter of John Campanis, which I would just encourage you to read at your leisure, but get some coffee before you read it. Because you'll want something to spill as you're reading it. You may not drink it, just spill it, right? That in it, this author says, you're doing the wrong thing by becoming better historians. The church, its history, everything about it is corrupt. We need to be taught directly by God's Spirit. Wow. You can find folk like that in the contemporary world as well. It's a good, rollicking, provocative read in which this person says, studying the history of the church is a waste of time. Instead, we need to rely on and be empowered by the Spirit of God teaching us directly. So, if he's right, then please don't come back next week. And don't go to the service today as well. Go home and rely entirely directly on the Spirit rather than on the manifestation of the Spirit that is manifested in one another, in the encouragement and the needs and the intertwined realities that we have when we meet together. As an indication of the reality of the new world, here is on the single page is a little bit of a sermon by a Dominican who preached this sermon in 1511, denouncing his employers, denouncing his nation, denouncing the mistreatment of indigenous peoples and increasingly the enslaved Africans who were brought to what is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. This is worth reading in part because we often fail to recognize that there were from the beginning dissenting voices, critical voices, prophetic voices that were critiquing the colonial project. Right. So also for your spare time reading this week. And then lastly, no Presbyterian church should be without a little bit of Calvin. And so I brought you a little bit of Calvin with some selections from his main work, The Institutes, from 1559. Good year for publication. He said, by nature, I love brevity. That was a lie, right? I mean, he said that like on page 600 of a 1,500-page book, right? By nature, I love brevity. So let's keep going for the next 5 hours, right? By nature, I love brevity. But this is a marvelous collection especially from book 3 of his Institutes. And I'd like for us just to turn to the next to the last page. In which he underlines the things by which we must be characterized as a people of God. We must be willing then to allow the world to crowd into our trusted and safe sanctuaries. The Reformed folk considered the church to be a place where we argue about some things, that the church is not exempt from politics. The church is not exempt from the most divisive issues of our time. And that it's impossible, really, to keep the world out or the issues of our culture. You can't keep it out, even with triple-paned glasses, windows, right? That the threshold of the church will render the issues of our time to be part of our discomfort, our troubled conscience, our empowered and provoked engagement and encounter with the difficulties of our time. So we may run and we may hide in the properly named sanctuary, but the very issues that drove us there, we will carry with us into those sacred spaces and should also inform our conversations with one another. It is this last page that I think can help inform where we're going next week. This last page where Calvin says, even the least among us has a claim on us, regardless of his status, regardless of his appearance, regardless of his difference, that everyone that we meet